We're going to try to get to chapter 10 today as we continue on this journey through Hebrews. And the jumping off point for chapter 10 was here in verse 22 mostly, but where the writer here is talking about how the first covenant was inaugurated with blood, and how the blood was important to the forgiveness of sins. Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And we spent some time digging through all of that, making sure we understood the distinction between forgiveness and atonement so we can make these comparisons correctly. And then I got into dispensationalism last week to create a contrast that we will look at a little more as we go through today. But this theological system that's been created that in its most common forms have these 7 dispensations where God deals with man in different ways depending on his timetable. And how at the beginning of the book of Hebrews, that same idea, not the system, but the idea that God dealt one way at the beginning and then deals with us now in a different way, occurs there. So there is some truth to this notion that the relationship between God and man, I'm going to use this word that fundamentalists don't like, but evolved over time. And so as we're going to look at this in a little more detail here as we open up chapter 10. We talked about this. This is where it really gets going here. How do you get forgiveness? Well, in the Pentateuch, when the law was given, the basis of forgiveness was atonement with a sacrifice that gets your sins forgiven. But then by the time we get to Solomon's dedication of the temple, Solomon talks about how simply approaching God, asking for forgiveness with the correct spirit, the correct heart, if you want to put it that way, can get you forgiven. In the same vein, as the law gets started, you see these constant references to God living with the people in the tabernacle, in the Holy of Holies, above the Ark of the Covenant. But then when we get to the point where the temple was constructed, Solomon makes this declaration, which we would completely agree with. Can God dwell on earth? Behold, the heaven and the highest cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? So again, there's a change in the way we see it in the Torah and the way it looks like a few hundred years later. So with all this exposed, this is really the question that I want to get grounded as we move into Hebrews 10. What changed between the giving of the law and the dedication of the new temple when Solomon was speaking? Because there's clearly differences there. One involves sin only being forgiven if you kill something. And by the time we get to Solomon, it's sounding more like how we approach the problem, and that is you ask God for forgiveness in a spirit that says, I don't want to sin anymore, and you can be forgiven. What changed? The way God relates to humanity, the way God relates with humanity, which is our go-to. That's what we see it as, and that's the approach of dispensationalism, or the way humanity relates to God. Is this really just exposing our bias. Did God change or did we change? With dispensationalism, the approach is God changed the way he dealt with man. What I'm suggesting is maybe that's not the case at all. Dispensationalism is a theology in essence. And religion and theology aren't products of God. Religion and theology are the invention of man. God trying to reach humanity is looking at the same evidence in the direction of God trying to reach humanity. That's what dispensationalism is saying. That God changes the way he works with man over time. And that's what he wanted to do. You can approach it another way, that humanity's trying to reach God. And we conceive of God in different ways over time. A couple thousand years, close to 3,000 years ago, everybody thought you had to kill something to satisfy the gods. But you can overdo this one too. And historically, that's been called deism. In this case, God keeps doing things and changing things in his approach to man. With deism, God put it all in place and just sat back and let it happen. And so we're trying to find him without any help from him, in essence. So you can go too far in both directions, which every time we come across a question, that's what happens. Anytime men start thinking about God, you get the extremes, but the truth usually ends up somewhere in between. So that's what we have here. So I just wanted to put this in there so that you're thinking about this in the right terms. It's closer to this. It's closer to humanity trying to reach God that is changing than it is to God changing, or God changing his approach to us. Not him necessarily changing, but God changing his approach to us. When the writer of the book of Hebrews said that Jesus went into a heavenly temple and poured out his blood on a physical altar, is that really what he was trying to do? Was he really trying to tell us that's what happened? Or was he just using the imagery from the Old Testament that they were all familiar with because they were still seeing it in their day? But they had already reached the point where they didn't think of it in the same terms as they thought of it when it was first inaugurated. Because clearly, for several centuries, they had understood that forgiveness wasn't built solely on the fact that blood was poured out, because that's what Solomon said. So it's the way we're looking at God, and I'll get there as we go through this. Pointing out here that as he's talking about the first covenant and the inauguration of the first covenant with blood, when he gets to verse 22, where he talks about there is no shedding of blood without the forgiveness of sins, he says what? Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. I don't want to overstate this, but think of it in this term. What this verse doesn't say is that God's demand is the shedding of blood for forgiveness of sins. It says under the law. If you're thinking about all these things as the audience of the book of Hebrews is, because they're thinking we want to go back to being under the law. And if you're thinking of it in those terms and you're trying to reach people who want to be under the law, this is the point. There has to be the shedding of blood for the forgiveness of sins under the law. Therefore, Jesus, to fit the pattern, to fit the rules established under the law, has to shed blood to forgive sins. Think about what that phrase is saying. When you're under something, What is that implying that your perspective, your view is? In terms of the law was a guardian. The point he and Paul have both made. It wasn't the end all, and people were reached by the law. The law had something to do, and it reached people. But it wasn't the way God intended for man to understand the relationship. It was the way men understood the relationship to God. You follow what I'm saying? It's two different perspectives. God didn't give us a way to do what he wanted done in Exodus. But there was a way to do it in Exodus that man was comfortable with. It was man's way of being comfortable with satisfying God, not God's way of being satisfied. We'll move to chapter 10. We read through these verses, but let me set up 10 by reading through these again. Thus it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these, for Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. At that point, what he's putting the emphasis on is that Christ has moved from earth through death to heaven with God to be the intercessor for us. That's the concrete implication of what he's saying here. But he talks about it in terms of the law. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But that as is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly awaiting him. And the point of emphasis for him is, if you want to approach the world through the lens of the law, Jesus has satisfied the obligations of the law. You do not have to go back to the law and start killing bulls and goats and sheep to satisfy God. God is satisfied with the sacrifice of Christ. So we don't need to get all wound up in the law and its workings and these people going back to doing all of that. It's all satisfied. And that's the point of emphasis. That's what he's trying to get through to them by using this imagery. Whether or not he really was laying out the system that Jesus actually went to heaven to a temple with blood and poured it on an altar is not something we need to be overly concerned about. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. So here's what he means. If these sacrifices had worked, you wouldn't have to keep doing them for sins, because your sins would have been gone. You would have no longer been conscious of those sins. They wouldn't dwell on you. So what he's implying there, what he's saying is that the sacrifice of Christ does do that. So then you are cleansed and your consciousness of sin goes away. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. In other words, by the fact that you have to do the sacrifices every year, you are constantly reminded that you are still in sin. Christ's sacrifice, on the other hand, isn't supposed to work that way. It's supposed to free you from that, because you get that cleansing one time, and you don't have to keep going back to the well. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Psalm 40. We're going to go through this little piece of Psalm 40 here because the very next thing he does in Hebrews is quote Psalm 40. I waited patiently for the Lord. He inclined to me and heard my cry. He drew me up from the pit of destruction, out of the miry bog, and set my feet upon a rock, making my steps secure. He put a new song in my mouth, a song of praise to our God. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. Blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust and who does not turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie. Now, I think it's a bit coincidental here that this is coming at a point where we're talking about theology and religion being the workings of man. Because notice how he puts this. Blessed is the man who trusts the Lord and doesn't turn to the proud, to those who go astray after a lie, because they have to make up a story that makes them feel good. You have multiplied, O Lord my God, your wondrous deeds and your thoughts toward us. None can compare with you. I will proclaim and tell of them, yet they are more than can be told. So he begins all of this with the praise of God. This is, we don't know for sure what the purpose of this psalm was, but it is a psalm of praise, and most likely is from the perspective of the king of Israel. So this would, in that sense, be a messianic psalm, a psalm from the anointed one. And that's clearly how the writer of Hebrews is taking it. So here's the part we're interested in, because this is the part he quotes. In sacrifice and offering you have not delighted, but ears you hollowed out for me. That's what it literally says. You've hollowed out ears for me. In other words, you've opened up my ears. That's what it says. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God, your laws within my heart. We get upset when people say there are contradictions in the Bible. But there are contradictions in the Bible. That doesn't mean that there are contradictions in the Bible that invalidate the Bible. But this is clearly a contradiction. He says, you didn't require burnt offerings and sin offerings. Well, we just read a lot of places in the Pentateuch where he said, you need to do burnt offerings and sin offerings. So he did require it in the law. So this is a spiritual interpretation. In other words, he's saying what we think today, that God didn't really need to have burnt offerings for him to be satisfied. He gave it to man to have man be satisfied, that he was satisfied. But what God was seeking was not the actual death of the animals and the smell of the sacrifice. So by the time we get to Psalm 40, it's like the change that we see with Solomon. It's not the burnt offerings and sacrifices that God really required. He required the obedience that demonstrated the fact that the people doing the sacrifices were sorry for their sin and that they wanted to fix it. So, behold, I have come. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God, your law is in my heart. So we see this in Psalm, and he's going to use this to talk about Christ. So here's how he puts it. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. So he's quoting what we just read in Psalm 40. Now, the ESV changes the word order a little bit in verse 7. The actual word order is, "Behold, I have come, it is written of me in the scroll of the book to do, O God, your will." This word order change loses a little bit of what the movement from Psalm 40 to Hebrews 10 does, because they don't completely agree. This is Psalm 40. "Behold, I have come, in the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will." So he does change the word order a little bit, but it's really more of a language thing than anything else. This is the Greek Septuagint of Psalm 40 follows this pattern right here. But there is another major change, because he said, remember the ears thing? Here we have, "But a body you have prepared for me." In Psalms it says, "Ears you have prepared for me." And this is not a slip of the pen. This is in some way a deliberate change. The Hebrew very clearly says, "Ears you have dug out for me." The Greek Septuagint also says, "Ears you have prepared for me." When they translated from Hebrew to Greek the Old Testament, 100+ years, up to 400 or 500 years before the coming of Christ. So it's much older than this writing. That Greek Septuagint is what the writer of the book of Hebrews is reading. And it was translated long before that. But the versions of the Greek Septuagint that we have are all much later than this. So in other words, we're reading the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was done 300, 400, 500 years before Christ, but we only have copies of it 400, 500, 600, 700 years after Christ. So we don't know what the original Greek Septuagint looked like. We only know what it looked like after this. So it could be that the version of the Old Testament that the writer of the book of Hebrews was reading actually said, "A body you have prepared for me," instead of ears. There is a little bit of evidence for this. We have copies of the Old Testament in Greek that are not the Septuagint, that are only 200 years after this was written. But they are translations of the Old Testament into Greek, presumably, or copies of the Septuagint, we don't know which for sure, in Christian manuscripts. Specifically, the most important ones that we have, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, and they're complete. These are the only ones that are actual complete books all the way through, and not just fragments. They say this, "A body." That is either evidence that the Greek Septuagints that the writer of the book of Hebrews was reading at the time said, "A body you have prepared for me." And so by the time they get it into those manuscripts, they were just passing it along. That's what was in the Septuagint. And then what we see later in the Septuagints that we have copied it straight back from the Hebrew that said ears. Or the scribes that copied the version of Psalm into Greek that were Christians changed it from ears to body. Why would they do that? To make it agree with Hebrews. So it wouldn't look like that Hebrews was using the wrong word. What is also very possible, and maybe the most likely thing, is that when the writer of the book of Hebrews wrote this and changed it from ears you have prepared to "a body you have prepared," he did that on purpose. because Christ had more than his ears prepared for his sacrifice. This gets us through this whole idea of sacrifice. And now we are going to start looking at this from what we would consider a more Christian perspective. He's put them in their place under the law, and now he's going to take them out, get them out from under the law. So we'll pick it up there next week.